So let's get the latest now from our correspondent Myriam Francois, who's outside the Louvre. Now, Myriam, the Louvre looks relatively quieter there now than it was last night, with the euphoria from those who did actually choose and want Macron to be in office. It looks like that euphoria is slipping to the sidelines, but it really did seem from some of the quotes last night coming out of his speech that Macron is very aware of those who didn't vote for him, and his message was pretty clear about how he wants to try and bridge that gap moving forward.
Certainly, one of the big themes of his speech last night was a message of unity, and one can understand why when you look at some of the figures behind yesterday's so-called success. Now, obviously, I'm at the site of the Louvre, which is last night where these huge celebrations were going on. You'd never know that looking at the place now. It's back to business as usual, tourists queuing up to head to the museum. But we last night were at Place de la République, amongst one of a number of locations, and that's typically a site for protest by the left and the far left, and many people that we spoke to there had voted either for Macron as a second choice or hadn't voted at all. It's worth bearing in mind that there was almost a quarter of French voters who opted not to vote in this second round. This is highly unusual in the French context. The second round has usually got a higher level of turnout than the first round, and if we compare this historically to situations where we've seen a candidate up against a far-right candidate, such as in 2002, there's typically a much higher level of turnout. So there are possibly two readings of this. One, of course, is that Marine Le Pen has very successfully normalised the image of her party. And we can also think that perhaps Macron, despite the idea that he's somehow managed to unite France, is actually ruling over a very divided country. There are, in effect, 4 Frances, possibly 5 if you count that portion of people who chose to abstain. There's the far left of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who has promised to be a strong opposition. You've got the right wing of the party, the Républicains, who were knocked out in the first round. You've, of course, got the far right of Marine Le Pen, which is now also promising a strong opposition to Macron. And you have, of course, Macron's En Marche movement. A lot of people we were speaking to last night very dubious about this notion that he represents the president of change. Everybody in France wants change. The question is, what are those different visions of change, and can they ever really be reconciled? Yeah,
Myriam, you've outlined a fairly intimidating opposition there to Macron. So I guess the question now is, how can Macron unify so many voices that didn't choose him or reluctantly chose him in order to keep Le Pen out, essentially?
Well, the big question will be who he chooses for his prime minister, who he chooses to make up his government. And these are things that are going to be watched very closely. A lot of people that I was speaking to last night, very dubious about this idea that he represents huge change. Actually, for them, there was a lot of continuity. One of the chants we heard last night as results were coming through was 5 more years, a reference to 5 more years of the socialist government. Of course, a lot of people saying, well, Macron has come out of nowhere. Just a year ago, he was a nobody. He created this movement. Another way of looking at it is that just a year ago, he was in the socialist government, which has been one of the most unpopular governments in recent French history. And of course, one would imagine it would be important to distance yourself from that legacy. So who he chooses to make up this new government, who he chooses as allies within Parliament, will all be a reflection of whether he's able to create this new balance within the French political system. This idea that somehow the traditional left and traditional right are no longer the divides within society. They certainly remain the divides within Parliament. And so the challenge for him now is creating a new smorgasbord, if you like, within the Parliament that is somehow going to balance all of these very different demands. And the first challenge, of course, will be this reform he's promised on the labour laws. That is a very controversial reform for the traditional left in France, and it's unlikely that you can reconcile left and right on that one. So that's challenge number 1 for Mr. New President.
Wow, big job ahead. Right, thank you for that, Myriam Francois, outside the Louvre in Paris for us there.